ever introduced women in it. It is also a narrative which is a very comfortable narrative to accept and to live with, because it bounds nations within fixed administrative and other boundaries. But that is not how people's lives function. And if you only look at 1947 and the division of India and Pakistan and the continuing ways in which people who were divided across those borders continue to subvert, flout, transcend those borders, to build up relationships, even as they accept sometimes the given national narratives of both and three nations, if you look at it later. But nevertheless, the ties that people have don't actually disappear. So, to me, national narratives always have to be questioned, and posited against them must be the smaller stories of the big part actors. And I want to give you just one very quick example. In Delhi, I heard of a Hijra couple called Sona and Chaman. When at partition people were divided on the question of religion, Hijras for whom the borders of identity lie of gender also had to choose their different countries. Sona chose Pakistan because that was Sona's home and the family was here. And Chaman chose India because Chaman knew India well. But every year, to subvert the boundaries that they were forced to accept, the Hijras got together, got visas, crossed the borders, and partied for 2 days. Sona is now dead, Chaman is still alive, and yearns and carries within his heart the desire to cross the border and come and meet the Hijra friends here. And to me, that is the kind of narrative that really needs to be pitted against the national narrative.
I don't know how much to mean and how you would interpret it.
I'm sorry I got delayed. An author called Dan Rimple is to blame for that because I was busy looking at his books. I think that...
If you get a bit closer in probably, yes, if you get a bit closer to the microphone.
Sorry. National narrative is a discourse created by the state to create uniformity of mind in the country. It is democracy's dark spot, a throwback to the totalitarian state where you can't even think otherwise. I think that Pakistan is living under three kinds of narratives. One is the external narrative, which is based on facts. There are people who believe those facts to be true. They are subject to ostracism and sometimes their lives can be in danger. The second narrative is the pan-Islamic narrative. It is not based on facts. It is opposed to the external narrative. It bases its defense on a consideration of conspiracies and plausible plots against the Muslim nation. The third narrative is, of course, the nationalist narrative, which sees the world through an Indian prism and believes that all ill of Pakistan can be associated by India and its malevolent policies towards Pakistan. Reading people like Urvashi, Butalia, I think there are alternative narratives too, which might rescue South Asia from these overarching and hostile narratives. I will make particular reference to a volume she edited on Kashmir. I think the narrative created there, especially from the point of view of women of Kashmir, opposed both narratives, the Indian narrative and the Pakistani narrative. And I think, first of all, India will benefit from her alternative narrative, and Pakistan in consequence will also benefit, because the opposed narratives have created conflict, and there is no way out except for people like Butalia to go out and find for themselves new facts with which to create a new discourse. If you are living under democracy, it is possible actually to create an alternative discourse and bring it to the people, and even perhaps establish politics on top of it.
Well, you can establish a different political discourse, but that's slightly different, isn't it, from creating a national story? I mean, isn't that a rather more ambitious project? To create a national story, a national narrative, that can't be done just on the basis of political discourse. I mean, that's a big project. And I'm not quite clear what you think the alternative national narrative would be.
I think the alternative narrative is created under democratic conditions in which freedom of expression is allowed. Even in countries like Pakistan, where you can actually lose your life speaking freely, but there is a space in which you can still speak. And I think there are more and more people in India and in Pakistan who are taking that risk. And it's only through the creation of this narrative, the alternative narrative, that this region can be saved.
And can I throw this open to all of you? We hear a lot about religion in Pakistan and that whole story, that whole narrative, as you put it, of religious Pakistan and the role of religion in the state since 47 onwards. What about the nationalist story? Is it diminishing? Is it growing? How relevant is it to young Pakistanis? I suspect it is quite relevant. And how does that look from India? Do you have a view on that? Yep. Well, any of the three of you can go.
Okay, I think there is a way in which both India and Pakistan want to present the linear national narrative and the history of the two nations coming into being. And the problem, of course, with that narrative, I can speak from India's side, is, first of all, it is very Delhi-centric. It leaves out a whole range of what goes on the peripheries as if those issues did not exist. But we know that almost from the moment, in fact, before the Indian nation came into being, it was challenged by many other subnational movements, including, for example, in Nagaland, in the northeast of India, where the Nagas refused to accept the Indian nation and wanted to set up their own, and that battle continues even today. We know that the issue of Kashmir was never actually resolved. So to present, the problem with a national narrative, I think, is that it looks at history as a linear thing. And history is never that. It never is a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's always changing and moving in a zigzag pattern. So I think that that's one issue with it. Indians would have us believe, our state would have us believe that the narrative, national narrative of Pakistan is the narrative of a failed state. That Pakistan does not have a democratic tradition, that speaking out here, people raise threats of death, but it's not very different from us. There are a number of activists who have spoken out and who have faced terrible Binayak Sen, Soni Sori. I mean, there are people like this. Iram Sharmila has been
described against military laws for the last 2 years.
Really.
And actually,
if you could move a little closer in, yeah.
Those are challenges, as Urvashi mentioned. And there's one of my problem with, I don't think one particular person no other person would really illustrate it better than sort of the problem with these national narratives. So in the northeast of India, which is sort of closer to Bangladesh and China, in this small state called Manipur, like Kashmir, they had various moments for independence and self-rule or autonomy. And there is military laws in operation, which is one thing is called Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And it essentially gives complete impunity to a soldier or a paramilitary trooper to shoot, to kill and damage property, and basically you couldn't be prosecuted in a court of law. There might be some military tribunal. And even if it's established that the person killed is a civilian, you need permission from the federal authorities, and those permissions never come. We know that very well in Kashmir. So this woman who was a 20-year-old student, she heard about some civilian killings in her state, and then she went on a hunger strike in protest. It's been 12 years. I mean, she's force-fed through the stew. She's in a hospital in solitary confinement. You're not allowed to go and visit her. And she goes to a court every 2 weeks where somebody might be able to talk to her. So the fact is, I mean, it's a great symbol of peaceful, non-violent critique of a failure in a system, of a rupture in a national narrative. But unfortunately, I mean, our states, do seem to be callous, and a lot of these things, alternative narratives don't seem to have any effect.
Owen,
Do you think those laws are still on the books?
do you think it's the problem of the nation state, and that the nation state is becoming outmoded? And in the European Union, for instance, they got tired of these nation-state wars, and they thought of something. In Southeast Asia, for instance, they have an idea of ASEAN. I think it was 1963. And in 1985, even SARC was formed. And there is a kernel of the reality of going beyond the nation-state and creating a grouping, which will first become one economy, and then the destruction of the national narratives which are hostile to each other.
Well, I certainly agree with you that the European Union is the most incredible project. I mean, it is so implausible that these governments will have given up sovereignty over their currency, over their borders, over free trade, over movement of people. It's all been signed away, which is incredible. However, one of the striking features of it is that the people haven't actually followed it. I mean, we're about to have a referendum in the UK, quite possibly, in which it's quite possible they will end this project precisely because the national story of Britain, an island nation, defiant against the empire, is so resilient, and the people are also so closely, that it is quite possible to imagine that this European project will fail. Certainly as regards Britain. I mean, in Europe there is more support for it. Don't forget, in France they have one vote which is within 1% of rejecting the European project. So one of the things, I mean, it is extraordinary that these governments are giving up so much power and fooling so much power. But you can look at it the other way and say that it is also a demonstration of just how difficult it is to move beyond. I totally agree with you. A false legend which is created over many generations, which is taken on as the national story. And in Europe those stories are pretty well established. I mean, here it's much more contested, it seems to be. You have a lot of issues that are unresolved in terms of what the national story is. But when they are settled, and in our case, this island's got a different story, and that's been a very violent and difficult issue. But for the mainland of Britain, the story is pretty settled. And it is very difficult to move on from it.
Just comment here to say, on the one hand, there is this larger vision that nations have, federations which perhaps subvert the national narrative or subvert the national boundary. And in the European Union is one such example, except that the only thing that they have been able to perhaps agree upon with difficulty seems to be how to make uniform cheese. You lose all the artisanal cheese. You don't really agree with that, I know. But I think while we look at the broader picture, we also need to actually look at the other pictures of the movements to resist the national narrative of the nation. And I have to say that I have yet to find a movement, a sub-national, anti-national, whatever you call them, movement that does not replicate the nation state. What is the model that they are fighting for? Where is the ideal community that they are fighting for? And really, where are women in that community? They really don't exist. So I don't know what the answer is, because the greater federation is a utopia which is rapidly...
Especially in our context, we don't. Something nice where you can make uniform, maybe decades, might not happen anytime soon. But these are problems. Even in resistance movements, yes, the structures of power do end up being replicated, and then the minority within the minority continues to suffer, and that nature of the powerful brain on the weak. I mean that has continued, and And across South Asia, one can say that. I mean, you know, when one thinks of Pakistan, the idea of like, you know, all the stories about this being a safe homeland for Muslims. And then last week we heard about the doctor here, and his 12-year-old child. I mean, even if you have a different passport, it brings tears to your eyes. It's terribly moving, and just fact is, yeah. I mean, in some ways we have to talk about these things, whether we're on this side of the border or that side of the border. And also, one of the problems that happens, I do want to talk about, is that when we challenge the national narratives, I mean, Urvashi and I, you know, we like a lot about Kashmir or various other things in India, but one should have some degree of freedom that if we come and visit Lahore, you know, we will still have the same lens. That if something is going wrong here, and a Shia doctor is killed, you know, a Kashmiri man who's been writing critically about Indian army should be able to think in the same way about that. I think we need to extend our solidarities also behind our pet, you know, territorial or ethnic causes. And those are things that will eventually help us challenge the larger national narratives and patterns.
The nation state has a problem, because if you are a nation state and you don't centralize, then you are like Afghanistan and Somalia. But if you centralize overly, then you have sub-nationalisms, more and more angry people who feel neglected. I think this has happened in Pakistan. First, in the case of East Pakistan, you are highly centralized, and East Pakistan opted out, they developed a sub-nationalism. And I think in now, the remaining Pakistan also, there are some national movements. There are movements in Singh and Balochistan. And I agree with Butalia when she says that once you give them encouragement, they will replicate the same kind of state, which is again unviable. So what is the new model? Is it the free trade model where the borders disappear not through smuggling but through free trade? Movement of people and more concentration of how to live commercially rather than how to live militarily.
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. It does seem to me that economics comes into it, and when you have states that have got rapidly increasing economic growth, you're going to get less of these tendencies. So I mean, the fact that in Pakistan there are these anti-national, Pakistan national movements, if you like, and there are those trends, I mean, is a reflection of economic success. And in the United States, which is a particular case, obviously, but in many other places, which are, even in China, flourishing economically, those pressures are less marked. So it is surely connected to simply generating an incentive for people to remain part of a particular national centre.
I think I'd like to ask Sarah to talk about her films, if she's inclined.
Actually, I wanted to maybe talk about something that I experienced that is a little bit related to national narrative in the sense that one's identity. And I was born in India, and we left India when I was very young, in 1974. And my mother is not Indian, and she took us to the U.S. and subsequently, since leaving in 74, we went back on a number of occasions, the first of which was 1982, and then many times after that. And then I lived in India for 3 years in the mid-90s, and about 5-6 years ago, I got this thing called the OCI, the Overseas Citizenship of India, which is something anyone can apply for if you've either been born there or you have a parent or a grandparent who was born there. And it's essentially a lifelong visa. Nothing really more than that, but you can live and work there. So I got that, knowing I was likely to come and go, and unfortunately lost it. And had to reapply, and when I was reapplying in this past year, I actually went to the consulate in New York, and they were saying mine was a special case, and that I had to show proof of how I actually originally came to the U.S. So it meant I had to get my mother's passport from 1974, and I mean, it was just kind of this very, pages and pages and pages of documentation, but meanwhile I had come and gone from India, I don't know how many times. So I think this national narrative is definitely also very tied to identity, and how complicated that process was for me to simply be able to go back where I was born, where half of my family is. It was very, it was actually quite emotional to feel that, there was this possibility that you were not going to get this permission. So I think that's very much part of this national narrative, and this issue of so many places around India. Like when I was in Kashmir and interviewing people and talking about some of the things that were going on there, but it was very clear after I made my film that the segment that in my film on Kashmir was something that, for instance, the Indian government was not in any way going to be supportive of helping to screen the film or that kind of thing. So going back to some of what he said, the issue of what's the way forward kind of thing, I think first and foremost, the things that are unresolved, whether they're from 47 or they're things that have manifest much later on, those things have to be dealt with in order to really deal with the idea that they're hostile identities or hostile national identities, because there's no reason for them to be, obviously.
Yeah, in the earlier session, I think you asked some questions, maybe not all of them were answered. Why do you think that Pakistan is not able to tackle issues of modernity, and what has it got to do with the national narrative?
Well, I think it does have a lot to do with it, actually, and I think the problem is, as we said, it's unresolved. So there are alternative stories as to why this country exists, and they're not agreed, and that really is quite fundamental and quite problematic. So obviously there are elements of this society who believe that the purpose of this country is to be an Islamic state, and they may not be very numerous, but that trend of thought is there. And they will trace back to 47 and say that is why this country was created. And obviously there are others who will say, no, not at all, this was created in order to keep Muslims safe. We were facing persecution, and that is why this country exists. And that's a very different idea. And if and then there's your idea, which is of, this is a democracy, or this should be a liberal, open society. So if you can't reach agreement, which frankly has not been achieved, on those very fundamental issues, you've got a problem. And I was quite struck that Aizaz Hassan, very early on in his long career, wrote a book where he tried to create a national story. I mean, quite consciously, I think, tried to tie it down to the Indus civilization and say that Pakistan was a direct inheritor of those times and that geography and those values. And that just didn't, no one bit on that. So that was a conscious attempt to do something to answer this problem, which failed. And it seems to me until you answer those questions in a way which people have basically agreed upon and form a consensus about, then you do have a problem. I mean, you do have a difficulty in saying, moving forward, because you don't have a basis of agreement.
Can I ask a question? I mean, when you say that you do need to have a basis for agreement, who's the you?
Well, the nation state. I mean, I'm no great defender of the nation state. I can see all the wrongs that have been done with internationalism. I mean, don't get me wrong. I rather admire the European project because example. I mean, I can see that it's a very ambitious and rather idealistic and romantic idea that you can join up 27 countries and make it more unified and more tolerant. It's just a more tolerant and open place. I can see that. But the fact is that the nation state is an incredibly strong institution, and there's not much prospect of you, as I understand it, in what would be some. Really sharing sovereignty in any, I mean, it's just totally unrealistic. So I thought before you move on, you need to resolve those issues of an agreed national narrative.
There are two ways people talk about disputes. One is that you front load the disputes, solve them first, and then you start trading with each other, allow the people to mix, and from there onwards, the whole region grows. For the past 62 years, we have been front-loading disputes in all discussions, and a dialogue with India goes on. But the disputes have not been resolved, which means that we can't move forward to grade 2 of the developments. And SARC has been actually a dream which has not come about. But the fact is that the world is now telling us more and more vociferously that you have to first normalize relations. And amazingly, in Pakistan, there is a consensus that normalization of relations with India will help us resolve our disputes. I would like to ask Urvashi, how does the Indian people respond to this? Do they believe that normalization with Pakistan will resolve disputes? And if some people resist, or some people, for instance, the Indian media, which sees Pakistan in a very negative light, what is their stance?
You know, like in every country, I don't think there is one consensus on the way that we might look at Pakistan, or the way that we might look at the question of normalizing relations with Pakistan. What is true is that there is an enormous groundswell of desire, willingness to normalize relations. There is a sense that it's been 60 plus years. You know, kitni der isko kheenchte rahoge, kyun kheenchte rahoge? Because there is no question that you can now undo what has been done. So why not actually live with it that there are 3 separate nations? And can we not live in friendship with each other? Because there are so many things to share. The pressure is coming a lot from the corporate world, which is always very interesting because the corporate world sees opportunities for trading. And if there's one thing that our states do listen to these days, it is the corporate world. So I think there is a desire, but there is also a huge amount of rhetoric. There's a huge amount of suspicion, and that has to do also with the problems within India on the question of religious identity. But I want to also go back a little bit, you know, to the whole question when Owen was talking about that we have to agree a narrative. There's a discussion about why this country, why Pakistan came into being, and we must actually find an agreed narrative. I was thinking that the whole business is quite complex. You know, if you look at 1947 and you look at partition, when I was working on partition, many of the interviews I did, people said this, and I'm sure the two of you have heard this endless number of times. Raje Maharaje badal jate, praja ko bhi badal. So aapne praja ko kahan se badal diya? How do you change the people? Then when I started to come to Pakistan to find my family and do interviews with them and write about them, my mother, who was a well-educated woman, a teacher all her life, you know, the only thing that she had in her head was, because her mother was converted to Islam, and she only wanted to know from me, उससे पूछना, अपने भाई से पूछना, कि उसने मेरी माँ को दफनाया था कि जलाया था. You know, and I mean, where is the nation here? You know, there are other things that are actually operating in people's lives. And yet, and I'm sure that many of you feel this, that when any of us is outside of our countries, the national identity becomes an identity that you actually want to own very proudly because you're proud of being what you are. And yet when you're at home, you might be questioning. So those of us who are first generation Indians, we don't have a sense of pride in India's past to self-reliance, which now, of course, everything shows to be, something that put India on a very difficult path and so on. So in a sense, I think that, I don't know, that the discussion about a national narrative must take in all the subtexts. And I don't know if it can. I don't know if that discussion, if the nation state is capable of expanding and stretching its boundaries to accommodate feelings, emotions, small histories, etc. I don't know if it can. But if it could, we would maybe have a beginning for discussion. I don't know if this is too romantic, but...
Sometimes I think, Basharat, if you can help me think further, is that in terms of India and Pakistan, the consensus for normalization and free trade has been a gigantic change in Pakistan, because Pakistan is a revisionist state, it is a challenger state. It, by nature, it cannot help hating India. But if you look at the two major parties, it is a bipartisan system. There is a consensus on having free trade with India. And they know the implications of free trade, which means that you have to remove the visa barriers, that you have to actually allow people to come across the border. I think for Pakistan this was a big leap. But India had an easier time of it, because they always recommended that let's forget about the disputes, or maybe let's solve the disputes later on and let's have normal relations. But the anger in India about people like Hafiz Saeed who go across and attack, the anger is based on facts. But the anger on our media is based on denial, which is where I think we are wrong. If earlier on I think that it is a great achievement for Pakistan to develop a consensus about normalization, the reaction to Indian media I think is not such a great achievement. What do you think?
Right. I mean, personally speaking, I'm still a Kashmiri. And you guys are trying to sort out things. While you might have a friendship test, we do remember it's occurs in both your houses, and what you have done continues to be there in Srinagar. We saw it last week. So, it's all great. Sure, do it. Trade, sell the shawls, sell whatever you can. I think it's still but on a more serious note, it's still it's good public relations copy. I mean, if you look at it seriously, I don't think the amount of trade is very significant yet. There's a lot of anxiety and apprehension on both sides. And of course, there are questions of terrorism that India always raises, and that becomes the dominant discourse in the jingoistic Indian narrative, especially on television. I mean, it's unbearable. It's basically, if you're watching Indian TV, all of you should be like people who slaughter children. I mean, I'm sure like the stereotypes in various Urdu papers in Pakistan aren't flattering either. I have a problematic relation with this question of the dispute that's always, it's been front and center, and let's throw it back and all have a party. I mean, that dispute is a concrete reality for me. It's nothing vague. And it's been 60, more than 60 plus years, especially the last 20 have been particularly brutal in Kashmir. And I don't think anyone can say that you guys and the Indians have nothing to do with it. Sure, we have our own sins. Kashmiris have their own mistakes and we have made our own messes. And the criticism that I can make of the Indian national state, I have to make of my own people too. We did not always treat the weaker with any generosity. Everybody has blood on their hands. But in terms of the scale, those are things we have to deal with. I find it for me, it's a source of discomfort, both India and Pakistan saying, oh, we're all Punjabis that speak Punjabi and, do some Bhangra. It doesn't help me. I'm still stuck with the bunkers outside my house. And when you guys are calling each other terrorists and threatening to bomb, that doesn't help me either. So as a Kashmiri, I don't really know, and it drives me up when I really have to think about it. Neither you allow fist or neither you hatred. I'm still at that point. Last week my parents were on a bloody curfew, they're going to go out and get hurt. It's a reality that doesn't change for one day. Urvashi
do you have a sense of how India and Bangladesh relate? Because sometimes when my friends from there come, they complain, especially about the waters and the way India has been treating Bangladesh. Do you have a point of view on that? An alternative narrative, let's say?
Yes, I definitely have a point of view on that. I think the ways in which, the Indian-Bangladeshi relationship has again not been a simple and straightforward one. It's been very fraught, and there have been times when it is quite positive and there are times when it is quite negative and quite difficult. Just as actually, and I think you can't think of the India-Bangladesh relationship without thinking of the India-Nepal, India-Sri Lanka, because it is the big brother, it is the big country. And in the subcontinent, it is the country that should actually behave with, if one can say that of states, behave with much more sensitivity towards its smaller neighbors, which I think India tends not to do very easily, and that is why relationships, for example, with Nepal now, it has been so troubled, and as an Indian, if you go to Nepal now, there is a strong sense among Nepali people that you are the big brother or big sister or whatever it is, and there is a strong sense of almost palpable resentment. I think that's also there in Bangladesh. I think that's also there in Sri Lanka at a level of unfulfilled expectations from the Indian state, where the Indian state will not speak out at the present moment in the ways that it should against all the human rights abuses, because it's very well aware of it. All the evidence is really huge. But of course the geopolitics dictates a different story altogether. I think what I find very interesting, and again you might think this is romantic, but I think this is a real alternative narrative, which is the ways in which people build links across those borders and continually flout what the states are trying to do. And those are like activists, those are certainly women. It was women who started from the first women's bus from Pakistan came to India many years ago, and it was that opened up the people-to-people contact, which has become such a major thing now. So certainly women's movement, certainly the environment movement, these are the people who have tried to maintain links and tried to look at the shared common history, the shared common problems, and the possible shared common solutions.
And the artists.
Yeah. And the artists, I'm sorry.
You went to Bangladesh?
Yes.
What is yours?
Oh gosh, well that was like 1994, and the Indian Airlines plane almost crash landed. So, I don't know. I don't actually have much to say about that because I have extremely limited scope of experience there.
And I have
Can I just add one thing? In the recent, the gang rape that took place in December in India and the big citizens movement that started. I'm just talking about the gang rape in Delhi in December and the big movement that started after that. It actually was acted as an inspiration for many other movements, and in Bangladesh, Bangladeshi women formed the biggest human chain ever to protest for women's rights, saying that it's the Indian sisters who have set an example which we are following. And I think those kind of things are really important.
Owen, I have a question. It relates to the emergent narrative of denying that Al-Qaeda and Taliban are killing us. We keep on saying it's America which does it. We think it is probably Indians who are funding these killings. You wrote this very interesting article titled "Who Killed Benazir?" Do you think our newfound narrative of denying that Al-Qaeda is doing anything to us is relevant in that case?
Well, it certainly is relevant, and I mean, from the outside point of view, it is absolutely baffling to come here. And I mean, I remember going to, I was a news reporter basically, and I covering suicide attacks here and bombings here, and hearing people. These are obviously done by the Taliban, obviously done by people who come from northwest of the country, and being told that it's America to blame for it. I mean, and I'm fully aware of what America's done here, and I completely understand the negative role it's played in many respects in Pakistani life. But I mean, I'll give you another example. In this city, I went to the Lahore, a place where they do fine art, a beautiful institution where they're training people in fine art to a very high standard. And there were sandbags outside. And I said, this is terrible, because they were teaching music in there, and the Taliban were threatening them. And again, I was told it was not the fault of the Taliban, it was the fault of the Americans who misled these young lads in the northwest to have such negative thoughts about some of their compatriots. So, I mean, seen from the outside, that certainly is the problem, and I think it probably relates back to the failure to agree, and particularly at the state level, to agree on what your national story is. And until, if it is an Islamist national story, then everyone knows where that goes, and that's that. If it is something else, then I mean, I'm very struck at this morning's session when Tariq Ali made his liberal comments, that I have not heard that on a stage in Pakistan before. I just not heard people get up and defend minorities and give a liberal point of view. And I thought the audience was hungry for it. I mean, people liked hearing it. And it's not something that people have got up and said. And the failure to articulate that vision of the national story is one of the reasons you're on the back foot, I think.
I think it's time for conversation. And can we get the mics in the audience, and please ask questions and direct them to the person that you want to answer.
I have a question. My name is Meera Sethi, and this question is for the panelists, but perhaps especially for Owen as a kind of international Western observer. Pakistan is the sixth most populous country in the world. We are by and large a Muslim nation / de facto Islamic state. We are also an emerging democracy. Formerly assassinated Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto was the first woman to lead a post-colonial Muslim state. So there's the good and the bad. Where does the international community stand on this? How are we being viewed? Is the international community still fixating on the bomb, that we are an Islamic country that has the bomb, or are they also looking at the fact that the PPP government is set to complete its first, a government is set to complete its first 5 years in office, and that's going to be a first for Pakistan. So what is the international narrative about Pakistan?
Well, it is. I mean, you'll find it incredibly simplistic and depressing, but from politicians down to news editors, your country is seen through one prism only, which is radical Islam. That is the only way people understand your country. And much as people like I have tried to put across a more fuller, more nuanced, more complete picture, it is extremely difficult, even with quite sophisticated people who are pretty well read, to go to, frankly, my editors and say, look, there's more to it than that. They don't get it. So that is how the West sees it, and that's how they frame their policies towards you, and that is the way you are perceived. Now, I have to say, the solution to that, you will say, is in the West, and it's time people woke up and educated themselves properly, read a few more books, and got across it. They're not going to. So, I mean, I rather agree again with what Tariq Ali said in the last session I was just chairing earlier, where he said, this is partly down to you, and social media is not quite enough. I mean, it's no good just tweeting each other. I mean, you actually have to put across a different vision, and you have to create a different reality. And that's quite a big project. But it is precisely, I thought, people in this festival will be precisely the sort of people who should be engaged in that project.
Can I just add to that? I think the international world communicates with you on the basis of the kind of policy you pursue. And if your policies are isolationist, based on denial, based on non-cooperation, based on an inability to communicate with your neighbors, then you get a negative impression. For instance, I think that Pakistan Army has been following an extremely isolationist policy in foreign policy, which it runs. It doesn't have a very clear landscape with Iran, for instance. It is very doubtful whether the killing of the Hazara Shias in Quetta has got to do with the Arab policy on Iran and our cooperation with the Arabs. It is very difficult for me to even understand why the Afghans hate us. Maybe it is some covert part of our policy which has offended the Afghans, and that doesn't include just the Northern Alliance, because they are traditionally our enemies. We have always treated them with suspicion. But even the Pakhtuns of Afghanistan have a negative point of view of us. If you go to Uzbekistan, I went there once some time ago. I could see that they feel scared of you. They are very resentful of the fact that we have about 5,000 Uzbeks terrorists living in Pakistan, and they go back and attack that country. Similarly, we have a relationship with the West which is full of unilateral denial of things. For instance, if they complain about the free movement of internationally recognized terrorists in Pakistan, we are very aggressively in denial. Even our courts will not cooperate in regard to punishment of terrorists that have committed terrorism outside the frontiers of Pakistan. So these are some of the things which form international narrative about Pakistan.
Yeah, can I just follow up on one thing? You mentioned, you sort of said, people perceive you through your nuclear status, which I fear, that's coming. They don't yet, really. And the whole proliferation of nuclear weapons, which, let's face it, happen from here. And I do take your point. A lot of Western policy is not entirely based on fiction. And nothing happened to Pakistan for that. And I mean, it was a very big thing that happened. 3 countries potentially became nuclear states one day as a result of, one has, one may, one nearly did, as a result of Pakistani actions. And that's a big deal. And really nothing flowed from that. And I just wonder whether that will be, when America finally breaks with you and when they're out of Afghanistan, whether that will come into play, and that whole nuclear story will be revived and Pakistan will pay for it.
I have a question. I'm Sadia Sundar, and I just want to know that when we are talking about the national narratives, there are multiple narratives in a society. There are narratives of minorities, the narratives of subaltern. So how do you think that these narratives, the narratives of subalterns, are placed in juxtaposition to the grand narratives constructed by state? Are their voice really heard? Did they really create a niche in the society?
I don't know where you are. Where are you? No, it's marginalized, and that is part of the problem. Because the national narrative is often willfully only a centralized narrative that does not wish to take into account all the other competing narratives, because these narratives often go against the grain of the national narrative. But if we can actually be mature enough to have national narratives that are not fixed once and for all, but that are also evolving and that also take into account others, then I think we've got something interesting going. But I don't think we're able to do that.
Okay. I seem to have a mic as well simultaneously. So if I may, my name is Osama Siddiq, I'm an academic, and I was wondering whether I could invite the panel to perhaps revisit the fact whether there has been an inadvertent oversimplification of the term, or an overemphasis on the term national narrative. And what I mean by that is that are we assuming here that there is a uniform, homogeneous national narrative across India and Pakistan? Does the provincial government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or do the provincial governments of Karnataka or Manipur or other parts of India exactly share the views stemming out of Delhi and Islamabad? Because it seems to me that there is increasing contestation within the nation state, even at the official level. And these are contestations over self-autonomy, decentralization, the notion of provincial citizenship, and there may be, various sort of divergences on the notion of foreign policy and relations with each other, which in itself has linkages with earlier history, leading to the emergence of these countries. So, wouldn't you think that that's another additional dimension? Yes, there's the subaltern narrative. There are all those ignored narratives of the minorities and the oppressed. But I think there is a lot more contestation within India and Pakistan, even at the official level, in terms of perceptions of external and internal threats and relationships with the neighbors.
Yeah, no, I mean, we wouldn't disagree with that. Well, the only thing, this was it was like revelation. It was a given topic, and one does deal with these subjects. But somehow there's one something I would like to add. While there are these differences, what a local government or what people who run a local government or a MLA or we call it MLA here. So they might have different views. But eventually, the national narrative is sort of the Islamabad. It's also a question of power. It is the narrative that has the official sanction and the power behind it. Of course, even in the context of Kashmir, there's political parties that completely accept India, but their take on foreign relations with Pakistan or some other place might be very different from the national government. But it's also a question of, they can try to use that argument to leverage something, but not in terms of eventually pushing things. The seat of power is ultimately the seat of power. And
I think we've come to the end of this session, but before we leave, I want to address these observations to Osama, who's asked the last question, is that when the central narrative, when the state narrative weakens, the nation state feels as if it is being weakened by the subnational narratives. So there is an extreme, like Afghanistan, for instance, which is not a centralized state, where the narratives clash and the nation state actually.
Same kind of phenomenon we see in Somalia.
But the evolution of the state itself, I think, leads to decentralization if the neighboring states develop good relations so that the clash of narratives doesn't lead to clash between states. I am perfectly familiar with the loosening of the grip of the national narrative in India and similarly in Pakistan. But the state of Pakistan might feel that it is being weakened and there may be a reaction against it. Of course, there are sub-national narratives all the time, but if they come as a normal democratic decentralization of the state, it leads to peace. But if the nation state acts against it, as I think Taliban and Al-Qaeda will, because they have a design for the state, if that happens, of course, then all the smaller narratives will be destroyed.